Okay, well, let's get started. Glad to have you here at this Messy Conversations. Very special in my estimation, Messy Conversations with Rosa Garza-Mourino and Tanjerine, um, and focused on the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. Um, and as I said last week, anytime you can be part of a conversation about Gloria Anzaldúa, just do it. Like, don't just do it. It'll be good for you. And in part, we do. This is becoming a bit of a tradition. We are honoring the anniversary of the death of Gloria Anzaldúa, who died on May 15th, 2004. 21 years ago. I don't know how to make sense out of that, but I guess it's true. So we'll get started with that momentarily. I wanted to mention next week is going to next Monday actually is the 100th birthday of Malcolm X. And so we will be focused on the life and legacy of Malcolm next week. Look for more information about that in the coming week. And just a quick reminder that Messy Conversations is a place where Antioch, all Antiochians, admin, staff, students, faculty, alums, anyone and everyone comes together to discuss, have conversations, learn more, be challenged around issues of racism and anti-racism, and a way of helping us as a community be engaged in that ongoing conversation so that hopefully we do better. And we can't start today, I think, without just acknowledging the challenging times and how important it is when we can be together. So challenging globally for a host of reasons, not the least of which is the genocide in Gaza. Nationally, institutionally, Antioch is having a lot of challenges as a community and as an institution. And then, no doubt, all of us in our various ways, our personal challenges. So it's good to be together, and we're glad you're here. Please keep yourself muted until you're asked to join the conversation. And how do you get asked to join the conversation? The easiest way to do it is put your question, comment, or just, hey, I want in the conversation in the chat, and we will get to you in the second half of our time together today. So with that, let me get out of the way, hand things off to my colleague, Rosa Garza-Mourino, to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Tanji and I prepare for you. Tanji, we say hi to you and to everyone. We are, as David was pointing out, this is a very timely conversation. The tools that Anzaldúa offer, many contexts are really needed right now. And in a conversation that I had with Tanji several months ago, Tanji brought up the idea that there was a connection, very interesting connection to explore between the concept of crisis and Anzaldúa, specifically the concept of crisis. And that's the reason we're here today with that particular framework. And before then, in a very Anzaldúan style, we want to pose to you a question in the chat, just to situate ourselves, all of us as a community in this moment in the room. And that is the question. And if I had to answer the question, I would do this. I would do that. So feel free to respond if you want to respond to that, and we will get back to that in a moment. Thank you, Tanji. And with that, we'll get started. And we get started with what is this crisis ideology that we learn from Anzaldúa and what applications are right now for this context.
you ready for me to start, Rosa?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was just watching some of the things that folks were sharing in the chat.
Yeah.
So thank you for those of you who are sharing. You are invited to continue doing so as we get started, and also want to honor the things that folks are bringing into the space, right? It's always helpful to tap into where we're at when we come into these kinds of conversations, and hopefully we'll kind of unpack a little bit more about how that can be relevant when thinking and feeling and working with Anzaldúa. So, but yeah, thank you for getting us started, David. Thank you as well, Rosa, and thank you to everybody for being here. I will say that although the topics of this conversation weigh heavily on me, right, they're certainly not pleasant. I am happy to be here in community with all of you as we engage with questions surrounding what we do now amidst the frankly terrifying things we are seeing playing out politically, right? And I'm also grateful to be here once again to have this space to draw on Anzaldúa's wisdom in difficult times. So yeah, I'm going to get started by providing a little bit of a framework of what we're working with, some kind of backstory to how I'm thinking about some things and using that as a launching ground, right? So as indicated by the title of our messy conversation this week, we're interested in gaining insights into navigating crises. And so I thought it helpful just to name some of the crisis-inducing actions of our current administration before moving into the framework that I want to cover. And this is only going to be a few things of many, right? But some of the things that, I can list kind of readily. We've seen mass layoffs and firings of government employees from several agencies under the guise of efficiency. We've seen denying due process to undocumented people, rounding them up and deporting or relocating them out of the country of their origin under the Alien Enemies Act, instigating a constitutional crisis by refusing to comply with court orders, prohibiting diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings in government workplaces, canceling research grants for any research loosely related or perceived to be related to diversity, equity, and inclusion topics, threats to cutting funding from institutions of higher education for advancing DEI initiatives, making moves to open protected lands to drilling, mining, and other forms of profit-seeking exploitation, attacking the rights of trans people, usually by vilifying trans athletes more recently, creating trade wars with other countries while isolating the US through hyper-nationalist agenda, weaponizing the Justice Department against non-loyalists, and we could add student protesters and fill in the blank for that, right? I could go on, I could keep naming a lot of these things. And these are only a few, right, of the many moves taken by the Trump and his administration within the first 100 days of his taking office. And I'm sure folks could add to this list, could elaborate on it. I want to acknowledge that like each thing I've listed alone can be crisis inducing, right? And yet here we are, we're grappling with them all at once. Yeah. And this is intentional. This is by design. I would say that although many of the moves that are listed or that we're seeing are unique to our current time and place, holistically speaking, they actually follow a decades-long tradition of using shock and awe tactics to spread and further entrench unregulated capitalism on a global scale. And then, of course, Trump seems to also be using them for his own purposes, authoritarian motives and whatnot, right? But nonetheless, the idea behind all of this is to create and to take advantage of a crisis so acute that it effectively stuns the public into paralysis and acquiescence, right, to these drastic policy changes and ideological changes. So think military coups, violent regimes, think economic crises, tragedies like 9/11, think natural disasters like tsunamis, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, things that devastate countries and profoundly impact people's lives. And all of these things are examples of crises that have been used to push drastic policy changes. So Naomi Klein calls this the Shock Doctrine. And it's also the title of her 2007 book, where she documents these kinds of violent tactics used over time. I highly recommend the book if you haven't read it. It seems just too pertinent to everything we're seeing. But the reason I'm thinking with it here in relation to the clusterfuck of crises we're currently facing is not because it's absolutely irrelevant. It is, right? But also because I was struck by the theory of change at the heart of the shock doctrine and how closely it resembles and maybe even overlaps with an Anzaldúan theory of change or transformation. And so here I'm thinking with Anzaldúa's work on the path of conocimiento, where the first stage of transformation is rupture or crisis. And I'll put the stages in the chat for folks, just so you can kind of reference it. This is just the gloss and referencing page numbers where you might read about that if you were reading Anzaldúa's essay. But according to Anzaldúa, ruptures are a powerful instigator of change precisely because they throw us from the world as we have known it and into a state of disorientation, or what Anzaldúa calls Nepantla, a messy in-between space. And although often terrifying and deeply uncomfortable, Nepantla is also necessarily a site of creativity. We have to put the ruptured pieces of our lives back together again. And even if we try to replicate our former lives, we can never truly be the same as we were before the rupture, right? That's the nature of trauma. And Anzaldúa is interested in the creative possibilities within Nepantla because if the world as we have known it is an unjust world, then remaking it can be an opportunity to take us in new directions toward self and social transformation and healing. And the work that this entails, spiritual activism as traveling the path of conocimiento, is detailed in Anzaldúa's essay, Now Let Us Shift. We've talked about it in previous messy conversations, and I think there's a lot that we can work with in our discussion today. But specifically, I'm thinking with the role of the Nepantlera in times of crisis. So Nepantla is the messy in-between space that comes at the point of rupture. And the Nepantlera is the artist and activist who draws from their own experiences of traveling the path of conocimiento as they help guide others through the process. And I'm just thinking, Rosa, we have a link to a glossary. Have we shared that yet?
I'm going to share the link to the glossary, yes.
Yeah, so we'll be using some terms from Anzaldúa and maybe not always be able to define them, but we'll share a link with folks so you can kind of see what these terms are as well, and you're welcome to jump in there. But yeah, so thinking with Nepantleras, another way that we can think with them is as artists of crises, right? They enact a studied attentiveness to how ruptures tend to move us about, and they seek to cultivate ways to use those ruptures for healing and transformation. So the question is, how can we use crises to take us in new directions individually and collectively? But having highlighted the role of rupture or crisis in Anzaldúa's vision of change, I do want to turn briefly back to the shock doctrine for a second. So in the introduction to Naomi Klein's book, she quotes Milton Friedman, who is the father of radical free market ideologies and essentially the architect of the shock doctrine for this cause. And in the quote, Friedman reflects on the opportunities a crisis can offer for advancing unregulated capitalism. And you can listen for some similarities. He states, quote, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. So that's a quote from Friedman in Klein's book. So there's some similarities here. So we have these two, I think they seemingly opposing forces, right, that are both interested in utilizing crises to facilitate change. And for me, the question has been, can the overlaps between these two forces provide insights into disrupting the trajectory our current administration is setting us on? I mean, and I think so, right? That's why we're here. And in thinking about this, fittingly, Anzaldúa actually wrote an essay in the aftermath of 9/11, which, as I said earlier, is one example of a major crisis that was used to advance unregulated capitalism here in the US. The essay, Rosa, do we have a version of that we're sharing in the reference links for the resources for this later?
Yes, it is. There is
Yeah.
the references for that are in the Messy Conversations references is there.
Okay, cool.
Sure.
And some of the like page numbers and references are like they're in an essay by a similar name that are in the glossary. But it's going to be a slightly different resource for this. But the essay is titled "Let Us Be the Healing Wound," which is something we can think of. The Coloshapi imperative "La Sombra y el Sueño." And in it, Anzaldúa reflects on diverging paths we could take in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11. And so the title of our messy conversation today comes from this essay when she states, and I'll give you the whole quote here, quote, "What we do now counts even more than the frightening event, close call, shock, violation, or loss that made the cracks in our worlds." And that's the end of the quote. But, okay, so every rupture we experience thrusts us into what Anzaldúa calls desconocimiento, or an embodied path or process of not knowing. And staying on this path is the easier thing to do because it validates and promotes impulsive reactions to pain and loss, right? Reactions like fear, retaliation, hatred, retribution through domination, things that beget more violence, right? But we also know from Anzaldúa's work that ruptures can put us on a path of conocimiento, right? So desconocimiento and conocimiento, which we've kind of discussed already, right? But Anzaldúa points out that the path of conocimiento is more difficult. It's the more difficult path because it demands that we move contrary to what our impulses tell us to do, which is strange and difficult work. And we can unpack that a little bit more. And really, I don't know. So all of that, I think this is kind of a great place. Like having said these things is a great place to start for the remainder of our messy conversation. Because it opens up a lot of big questions. You know, what does traveling the path of conocimiento demand of us today in this political climate? And how might we go about doing that work? I think those are the big questions that can launch us into talking about all of this. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Tanji. Thank you so much for this context and for the different ways that this crisis topic interacts with the work of Anzaldúa. And one of the pieces here that calls my attention is this idea of desconocimiento, which is on knowing or on learning or forgetting or ignoring, outright ignoring something. And then go with some sort of learned ways to face crisis that are almost automatic responses that lead to violence. And what are the alternatives when that pathway that is self-destructive, that could be the one that most social situations can lead to? How can they be averted? Because how is it possible? What is the way to look at that is gonna take us into this conocimiento, that is to accept these 7 stages, to learn how to go through those 7 paths of conocimiento as a way to stay away from violence or violent responses? Is there anything to add there? Tanji, I think you already covered part of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would add is the interesting thing about conocimiento and desconocimiento is they sound and feel like opposing forces, but you can't actually have one without the other. And so being launched into desconocimiento, the retaliatory, the rage-filled impulses that we might have are actually really valuable information. And we shouldn't pretend that they don't exist or pretend that we can be without them. They're telling us a lot of really important things about the wounding nature that we're facing, and about the options that are familiar and available, But that doesn't mean that we have to follow them, right? So it's working with them to try to do something else. And so it's not a matter of denying them. It's a matter of attending to them. And this is actually a type of shadow work. Anzaldúa would call this shadow work, or facing the shadow beasts. So we don't deny the shadow sides of ourselves. And shadow beasts are kind of any of the unpleasant things that arise for us in times of crisis. It can also be things like on a collective level. Shadow beasts can be, in the context of the US, the history of colonialism and slavery and violent capitalism, right? All of these things are a type of shadow beast that it doesn't serve us if we ignore that they exist. We should actually go into them and towards them, and working with them and doing that difficult work of engaging them is actually what helps conocimiento to come about. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, and reminds me of part of conversation we had in the past when we were preparing for this, how the part of the Anzaldúa, the value of her work is how she's tapping on Aztec folk and history and archaeology and different elements that bring some cosmovision that she applies to their understandings and metaphors, but also this one that I'm going to bring up that we talk about is so interesting. That is this goddess, that is the moon goddess, that was shattered in pieces, and how this moon goddess holds a shadow, and that is a permanent shadow. That is something that comes with it, right? So we know that there's this Jungian tradition to look at the shadow. One distinction, I'm not very familiar with Jung in the sense that I can speak as, with the expertise about it, but I do know that there's this approach of the shadow as a personal work. And Anzaldúa, everything that I read and know and discussed with you, Tanji, about the shadow has to do with this combination of the personal with the collective. Within the collective, the understanding of interrogating the social dynamics where I'm inserted in. That is the most important element there. So this holding the shadow, I think is a very important component here. In anything else to add to that, opposing forces, you just address those. I wonder how do we connect that to the healing wound process?
How do we connect it to the what? Sorry.
To the healing wound process. How we connect that to the healing wound process?
Yeah. So there's a few things that come up there. It actually makes me think to the essay itself, where it's called the Coyle-Shapley Imperative. And let's see, let me look at the title exactly. Sorry, make sure I get it right. It's let us be the healing wound, the Coyle-Shapley Imperative. And there's two things happening there simultaneously. So first, I'm going to start with Coyle-Shapley, which you just mentioned. She is the moon goddess, right? And this is Anzaldúa's way of drawing on other forms of mythology for a kind of enlightenment, right? And so something that's really interesting and powerful about the metaphor of Coyle-Shapley is she's the moon goddess, but it also kind of helps us to think differently with the idea of consciousness and enlightenment, because she thinks of the moon as the light in the dark, versus, so you're working with the light in the dark. And you were talking about sort of, I mean, one thing that can be really, especially within Western ways of thinking, is thinking in binary terms. And the moon is a helpful metaphor to push us away from thinking of either or terms. So when you think of the moon, there's always the light side of the moon and the dark side. And that doesn't, that's the whole, holistically, that is the moon together, right? And those forces are always playing out on the moon. And so thinking with that, anytime we talk about conocimiento or desconocimiento, or thinking about the individual or the collective, kind of collapsing those binaries to help us think more holistically. So there's that. I'll shift to the question about healing. So the idea of, so when we think of like what is available to us when we think about enacting transformation in our current times of crisis, the idea of being the healing wound, I think is an important reminder because it actually kind of shifts the ground that we stand on, right? It moves us from, well, kind of unpacking like being the healing wound, right? That suggests that it's something that we cultivate within us versus seeking something outside of us, right? So cultivating inner works, inner wisdom. But again, we have to pause and make sure we're kind of collapsing that binary of the inner outer, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But also healing, the idea of healing connotes a process. So there's not a single right answer. She doesn't say, let us heal the wound. She says, let us be the healing wound. It's an ongoing process. Also, I think the idea of starting from the premise of woundedness, change what the options are available to us. If we think of things like America First nationalism versus interconnectivity and interdependency, or vilifying undocumented people or trans people, these things are enraging occurrences, right? But they're also indications of what Anzaldúa would characterize as deep personal, interpersonal, and collective wounds, right? And if we move on a path that's fueled by rage, we might not engage with somebody else's woundedness, instead actually work to enhance the woundedness of somebody else and ourselves. But if we're saying these are symptoms of a larger woundedness, I think that changes the stance that's available to us in contending with these issues. Are there other options that aren't just invoking domination over another side that we think is wrong in the name of our sense of righteousness that we can work with more relationally? So I answered like 2 big questions there, but I think every time we speak to one, we might open up 5 other questions. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. And we know that the questions are just to open more questions. Unfolding Anzaldúa's style. I got caught up, or let's say not caught up, but inspired by this point about the binaries. That you explore the word of Anzaldúa and finding binaries is almost impossible because it's constantly creating this rupture moment in the thinking process. So in this case, I was thinking in terms of in which ways what we are not seeing in the middle of the crisis, not seeing about oneself being in the crisis, is just start fixated with a moral outrage against whatever is happening, right? And then that again opens a new opportunities to engage in violence or to flow with the violence. How does this work with some ideas of how this could be create more ruptures as opposed to go with standing in a higher moral ground against something that we consider as unacceptable, like the many things that we are seeing right now?
Well, I think that gets at the trickiness of the work, right? I mean, I heard you use 2 phrases, and I think they're important to think with. How do we engage our moral outrage, which should be present in the many things that we're seeing happening, without taking the moral high ground in such a way that we alienate other people in our community, other people who are trying like we are to do this difficult work? And I don't fully know, but I do think that there's something about seeing us all as having this collective woundedness that can help change how we interact with folks. I mean, I can tell you, I have a hard time interacting with people when I know that they are a Trump supporter. right? Because my sense of moral high ground is certainly triggered. It's activated. And I have all sorts of questions. Even if they're like, I voted for him, but he's crazy, I still have all sorts of questions. Like, how could you possibly do that? And all the things that he stands for and all the damage that he stands to do, I don't understand. And the easier route is to judge them, to distance myself from them, to vilify them. And in doing so, I could lose an opportunity to learn some really important things about how the world works beyond my embodied experiences, which is a big ask. It's not a popular ask. In fact, Anzaldúa pissed off a lot of people who are activists by trying to do this difficult work, right? Yeah, that's kind of my first response to those things of just, I don't know, except that, well, here, when I have those emotions towards people who I find are Trump supporters, part of the engaging the shadow-based or doing that shadow work is to notice them, to notice that they come from important places. So I'm not gonna pretend I don't have them to say like, oh yeah, I can embrace everybody. But like they come from important places. It comes from important embodied knowledges about, you know, all the things that Trump stands for. And I don't have to let them animate me in the ways that I want through, you know, blanket distrust or severing ties with people. I can do something else.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Thank you, Tanji. And there's something else, doing something else is going Anzaldúa again. It would be part of this Nepantla, the in-betweenness, instead of taking for granted that what you assume is there. It opens up against the binary, creates a rupture in interpretation and acceptance that you are dealing with more than one identity in front of you. It might be engaged in a political practice that is unacceptable or seems unacceptable or definitely unacceptable, but there are many other identities at play in that context, and that is again another rupture. So if by rupture is we are creating this opportunity to open up the ways that interact and interpret what we are dealing with, as opposed to assuming that we already have a diagnostic that is clear and that prescribes a particular line of action that we probably learn in other contexts, that if we learn them, I would dare to say that if we learn those practices under patriarchal context that where we live, we are likely to respond with violence because that is the most successful way to do it under patriarchy, right? So far. Where do we go from there? It's already 4:34. Would you like to bring up some closure or reopen conversation just to open to the other people in the room, Sanji?
Well, if we have just a little bit of time, it might be kind of generative to talk a little bit, you know, you and I have talked about this before, but, you know, I opened with some of the overlaps of what, you know, the shock doctrine for you know, for clarity here, the idea of the shock doctrine and the overlaps for, you know, the path of conocimiento. There's a lot of overlaps there, but there's also some differences that you and I talked about. You named one, I named another one. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the differences in the how these two seeming opposing forces kind of employ crises? You talked about the individual versus the collective. Is there anything you wanted to say about that?
Mm-hmm. The individual versus, well, it is we see this dilemma constantly between opportunities to succeed by taking care of the self and ignore the others, and how taking care of others or putting others first or aside as part of the work that we do, it's so unusual that creates the impression that is more and more and more work. So I just find that very attractive in terms of a challenge. I find that intriguing in terms of what does it take But I see that under the dominant system where we live, still individualistic options seem to be the ones that are already available and the easiest ones to take. So that is the reflection that I once again, we have seen that in many other disciplines or discussions in other fields of knowledge, and we have seen that before. But when we think through the lens of Anzaldúa, it brings into shared focus this nonsense of going to that direction. The individualistic path has short-sighted and self-destructive, basically.
And I know one thing that you kind of reflected on at one point was another, like, a big difference with traveling the path of conocimiento is it's a collective process, kind of looking out, like, because there is that, as one travels along the path, there is that breaking down of perceived barriers, such that we perceive ourselves as connected with the world, and the world isn't sold, right? That's part of the collective mindset or understanding or consciousness that comes from traveling the path of conocimiento. And if we follow the trajectory of the crises that are set for us by the Shock Doctrine, which is inherently capitalistic, that is definitely an individualistic mindset, right? The individual is competing for all the riches in the world, all the access to the resources and whatnot. And the most competitive person wins. And that is actually a really elevated way of thinking about things within that trajectory. And it flies in the face of communal work. I mean, even when we talk about efficiency, right? It is inefficient to work with a messy collective because we have to contend with the differing viewpoints. We have to contend with the different realities that folks live in. And it takes time to do that. But if we ignore significant portions of the population, we can be way more efficient with how we make decisions and how we utilize resources. So that's one thing. And then another diverging area, right, of crisis and transformation. Anzaldúa diverges also in the idea of the shadow work, right? So for her, the pantleras are artists and activists who navigate crises, and part of what they do is they bear witness to personal and collective injustice. So that's actually built into that work. The spiritual activist work is bearing witness to the injustice. And we see right now, there's been active moves to not bear witness to those things. Like, that's indoctrination. That is DEI woke indoctrination. We won't look at those things, and we'll even be willing to take steps to, you know, pull funding from institutions that are bearing witness to these things, and we'll vilify it. And that surprisingly gets other people on board, surprisingly and frighteningly, right? But I would say, yeah, the dedication and the brutal honesty that it takes to do the shadow work, to face our shadow side and our collective shadow side, is difficult, messy, uncomfortable work. And that is also something that is demanded of us on the path of conocimiento versus desconocimiento. And yeah, so that's another important difference, right? That I thought would be helpful to cover.
Yeah, nice day. Before we open, thank you, Tanji. Before we open up with people, I just wanted to contribute with this idea that there is this persistent question from Anzaldúa about what I'm not seeing now. Is that what I'm seeing is devastating, right? What I'm not seeing now within that, or within me, or with that question is a really interesting question. And we can just leave it there for people to go over the chat, because we have lots of words that people contribute to the chat, and a specific question from Consuelo. If we're okay, can we go with the question from Consuelo, and then we go to the words. Consuelo, do you represent your comment question?
Yes. So for me, as a Chicana, identifying as a Chicana, we in this community have always embraced the term Nepantla as being neither from here, the U.S., nor from there, Mexico. So we're always caught in between. And I wanted to know how that term is reflected, or how it is that that term is used here to represent what this topic is discussed, like what this specific topic addresses.
Good question, Tanji.
I can take it.
That makes sense to everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the way that Anzaldúa uses the term both jives with that and then takes it in, or continues to work with it and the power of the metaphor, right? So being from neither here nor there is a liminal identity, right? And that actually gives you an embodied knowledge about the world that people who feel very solid in where they're from have a very solid, say, national identity, aren't going to have, because for them, the world is a little bit more stable. But the people who embody the borderlands, the people who embody Nipatma, have a very different understanding of how the world works. And this is a strength. This is an important embodied insight.
Well, I'm not even talking about the borderlands, because we're deep in the city of Los Angeles, and yet we still are neither from here nor there. We're not anywhere near the border, but we are still not from either here nor there. And that's what
Right.
I was stuck on. I was stuck on the term Nipantla as how it is being used in this context, because for me, that term is always been about a cultural and ethnic ambiguity.
Yeah, and I would say Anzaldúa understands it that way too, and then continues to use it. So being from neither here nor there is a type of borderland. It might not be a geopolitical borderland if you're very entrenched in LA, right? But it is still a kind of borderland, because the boundary of here or there, where is it? You don't know. You're from neither of those places, and so you're still within that liminal space. And Anzaldúa feels like it's very important to tap into the embodied knowledge that comes from that liminal space, because there's opportunity to do something else. It exposes the instability of being from here or there and enables us to go somewhere else with it. Does that make sense?
Yes,
you.
that does make sense. When you said that borderland is sort of a social construct, I can understand that.
And I would like to add something, and thank you, Consuelo, for the question, because this is a reminder and how Anzaldúa uses certain terminology that has such a power of metaphor, so strong, that can be applied to different contexts and to different situations. And it's a matter of being open to understand that, and just follow the thread of the question or the conversation, and you're gonna find possibilities to interpret and apply. And that's what calls my attention also all the time.
So just to clarify, I am open to different interpretations. I just needed to know how that was applied to the context of where my own perspective.
Thank you, Consuelo. Yes, I saw that way.
You're muted, Rosa.
Thank you. I meant to scroll the chat, not to mute myself. Let's go with that. Well, we started with acknowledging how we are hanging in this situation, and the pattern that we see here in the chat is primarily challenging. Overwhelmed, tired, soaring. How do we go about this, Tanji, when you are in these sessions where we share these words with people?
Responses to the check-in prompt we gave folks?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, when we talked about inviting folks to share, we kind of titled it in our notes, modeling Nipanlera, right?
Mhm.
Asking folks to tap into what they're carrying on their mind, body, and spirit together, right? Is a helpful way of just having us pause, which is something that Anzaldúa wants us to do. It's something that Nipanleras want us to do, is to learn how to pause amidst the disorientation, amidst being thrown, amidst the crisis, and attend to the body, because our body's telling us really important things. And so even just that simple moment of like, hey, we're talking about crises right now. We're talking about big, scary things that we're watching playing out. That simple step of pausing and saying, well, how do I carry these things on my body, can tell us a lot. And it can open up, as you were you were alluding to what I would call curiosity, that Anzaldúa helps us to embrace. There is that curiosity of, where does that come from? Why is that here? What can I learn from it? And where can that take me when I engage with other people, when I engage in these other issues, right? When I feel rage on my body, when that is the primary thing coming from me, it can be very difficult to move in any other way but violence, right? And if I can pause, I can tap into, I'm feeling rage, then I can work with it instead of it operating me. So that's kind of how I would speak into that. And that's one reason why it can be important to just practice those check-ins.
I can see that. There's a reminder here from Jen. Jen, you brought up the idea that, Jennifer, reminding you of the Tower card in Tarot. I'm not familiar with that card. Would you speak more up to it, Jennifer?
Hi there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like working during this conversation, so I'm not sure if I can add too much. But at the very beginning, and I'm like really processing a lot with what we have to say. I feel like we have very heavy concepts, and I feel intrigued to like look into all of this a lot more, because this is also the first time hearing about all of this. But as we're talking, I'm just kind of, that concept that we started out with of just kind of like this, the Tower card is like everything is crumbling. The tower is crumbling and falling apart, so that in order to rebuild, and like that, I just was hearing that come through at the beginning when I joined into the conversation of just needing some kind of I don't know, failure. I don't know if failure is the right word, but just like all of these things that are happening right now are really scary to experience, but it's also been kind of, I don't know, somewhat of a sign of hope. And it sounds like it's in line with some of the things that have been shared, is that like we need to break down in order to rebuild. All these systems that that have been in place for a long time need to break down in order to rebuild. So that's kind of all I have to really go into that. But yeah, I appreciate you bringing me into the conversation, and I really appreciate everything that's been shared.
Thank you for taking the time in the middle of work to be present and also to reply. And Jennifer, just for your convenience, Sarabeth just reposted the stages involved in this process that made you think about the tower. And maybe you can catch up with those later because they're in the chat, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have David, we have a comment and question you made. Would you represent yourself?
Sure, I'll represent myself. Thank you, Tanji and Rosa, for leading us through this conversation on Gloria Anzaldúa's work. I was just thinking, as I often do when I'm thinking about Anzaldúa, about that there's a connection between the notion of crisis and crossroads. And that's in mythology, that's where the trickster hangs out, loves the crossroads, and people make their offerings to the trickster at the crossroads, because that's where accidents happen. That's where things get shaken up. That's where and so it's a potential catalyst for change. It's also an accident, right? So it can be really hard, difficult work. And in her methodology, you know, obviously it's not linear. It's often, we think of it as linear, the different stages, right? They go in all kinds of directions. But I'm just thinking that, you know, it can be really hard in the context of an accident, a crisis, to pick yourself up and put yourself back in the game, get your hands busy doing the work. And so, you know, what wisdom does Anzaldúa have for us that who find ourselves in that position? And this is a lot of the comments earlier when you asked how are people doing, and so many people seem to be struggling to carry their own ass at this point. So thank you.
I have thoughts. I didn't want to trample you, Rosa, if you.
Me? Well, no, my immediate response, if I do an immediate response, that is such a big question, is that there is this element of Anzaldúa that is inspired by shamanism. Now that you mentioned the trickster, I was thinking about the shamanistic element here, and one of the lessons from shamanism is that is embedded in a very tight-knit community. So that is the crossroads or the crisis of the moment of a desperation is not personal, it's not individual, it's collective. The acknowledgement is collective. So I think that there's something there that Anzaldúa is pointing out of how to live through that as a collective, rather than thinking that is your own burden to carry. But in this context, in this society where we live, I wonder how to make that shift in a consistent and more regular way, because it goes against the grain. And Tanji, I step out of the way because probably you have your own version of these responses.
Well, it's a great question, and I love the idea of the crossroads being where accidents happen, right? Like, right. And it actually makes me think of the quote state, which is kind of where I generally find myself in these days. Like if I took my responses to the check-in and put it in one word, it'd be quote right? Which is the third stage of conocimiento. This is the place where you feel cut off from your power, you're undone. The overwhelm of Nepantla is just too large and too heavy. And Anzaldúa says that this can be a way station or a way of life, right? You can kind of be stuck here for quite a long time. But something else that she says about the quote state is it can be a time where you feel like you've gone off the path of conocimiento, where you've strayed from it. But eventually, when and as you work your way through it, you find you were never off the path to begin with. This was actually part of it all along. And so that's something that I kind of turn to in your question, David, because as we're struggling, as we're raging, as we're, feeling about these things, as we're trying to find our way, we are teaching ourselves really important things about how to do this work, and possibly how we don't want to do this work, right? Because I've certainly done things that I don't agree with in retrospect, and, in my own moral outrage and indignation, right? And that's really important part of the process. And that's part of that holistic part of the process too. We want to deny the lost feelings. We want to feel great when we feel those moments of conocimiento, but it's also the desconocimiento that helps those moments of conocimiento do much more work for us. And I think that's related to that question, or, the insights about the tower and the rubble that we're working with. It can be really, easy when, and it's almost always by accident, right? We don't plan for these things, although the Shock Doctrine, there is some planning, it sounds like, going on there. Project 2025, I think we could work with that. But for those of us who kind of run into these crises, we don't plan them, we find ourselves in them, we have to work with them. And it can be very scary to see the pieces of our lives in rubble. And we want to be rid of those things. We want to be free of those things, but we can also encounter them as media, artistic media with which we can recreate with. And Anzaldúa is inviting us into that. And one of the hardest things is sometimes we can't understand them those ways until we have made our way through a kind of, or one aspect of the path of conocimiento to get somewhere new. That's when, to rewind to your question, a hopeful thing for me in these times is remembering the times I've made it through the path of conocimiento and other devastating experiences in my life, and then drawing on strength from that, right? Because I mean, I can think of some pretty, very scary, devastating, like personal times, and the ways that I've been able to rebuild from that, and the insights that come from that is well worth the labor. And then, so those are things that I lean into and draw on as I navigate these new situations. So I don't know if that helps. I'll pause with that.
Tanji, would you add, please, the facultad? Because this is part of the response to that you mentioned earlier. I don't know if today, but because I have so many resonances of our conversations. But the facultad is this reminder that whatever it is that is coming against you or that you feel trapped in and broken is by design. So it's not something, it's not by chance. It's not something that just bad luck or anything like that. It's by design in a society that is increasingly being engineered this way, the way we are living. Is that an interpretation of facultad that works, Tanji, or am I exaggerating?
It is for most, but noticing David has something to say, so I'm
Yes,
watching that
of
as
course.
well.
Sure. Okay.
No, just if I wanted to first thank you for your responses and then have a follow-up. Because I think what a lot of us feel is the crisis. We feel it existentially. And so and I'm looking at the people gathered here at Messy Conversations. Well, these are leaders of our institution in a variety of ways, right? These are and so how do I'd love to have conversation amongst all of us about how do we help our co-Antiochians in these moments of crisis that feel deeply existential. How do we help in an Anzaldúan kind of way? That's a too broad a question. I understand that, but it's a topic of conversation. It interests me. So thank you again.
What specifically do you mean, David, when you say Anzaldúan type of way? What specifically do you mean?
Well, just, I mean, I love Anzaldúa's work, and I find it a helpful way to understand what's going on in the world, in yourself, in your community. I think there should be Anzaldúan approaches to therapy. Like that would be way better than most of the therapy, probably. So, you know, I don't want to go into all the stages because Tanji and Rosa have done a lot of that, but that's what I'm referring to. What can we learn from her to help us? And I mean each of us in the room as members of the Antioch community, leaders in that, you know, people with voice in that community, whether students, staff, admin, faculty, help the community during time of crisis when it's too tempting to isolate, to separate, to see the crisis as existential. This is just about me as an individual. Yeah.
Well, when you pose that question, one of the first things that comes to me is a quote that I don't know, I've found pretty comforting over the years of reading Anzaldúa's work. And it's on the version that I have let us be the healing wound. She says, we are all wounded, but we can connect through the wound that's alienated us from others. When the wound forms a cicatrice, the scar can become a bridge linking people split apart. And, you know, you mentioned that a lot of folks here are in pain or struggling, and this is existential. That commonality can be a powerful bridging or bonding process that helps us come together. And we can take our, you know, I imagine every single person in this space has a deep connection to some sort of wounding force in their life that they've learned big and powerful lessons with, right? And if we pool our collective wisdom in our relationships with pain and discomfort, and we work together creatively, that can be a really important way, like honoring the wounds and the insights that folks bring from those wounds in this space to do the work that we want to do or that we're trying to do, even as we don't know how to do it, is really important. And simultaneously, you know, you mentioned the different roles that people have. Well, there's varying levels that we have access to of doing this work. We can be doing this work in deeply personal ways and kind of always need to be in order to have the insights that we need. But there's interpersonal ways of doing this work as well. There's institutional ways of doing this work. So as an adjunct faculty member, I have less institutional power to do some of this work than other folks in this space. And I can think, well, as an adjunct faculty member, what institutional powers do I have? How can I wield them in the ways that are available to me? And other folks with different positions can think of that as well. But one of the important things is honoring that that's what we're here and we're trying to do. And we're going to make mistakes as we do it. And how do we continue to hold each other up amidst those mistakes? Because right now, the rest of the world is what is tearing us down. And if we continue to tear each other down based on the mistakes we make, then we're just letting those forces win. So how do we bond together to work with those things? I think that's also helpful.
Angie, I'm so grateful for your answer. Thank you for your time.
We are seeing more contributions in those lines. Angela, we must have courage. Angela? Where's
Oh yes,
Angela?
I'll have some courage here.
Thank you. Please tell us.
Yeah, I think, you know, David's talking about, you know, this existential question of like making meaning of everything that we're engaged in together with people we know and love and people we don't think we care too much about. But we're here on this planet at the same time, you know, going through all of this. And I think having courage for the truth is about curiosity, and openness, and listening, even the quietness in between sentences or conversations. And it's also, you know, truth is many things. It's individual. It's something we see and process from where we're standing in the moment, and we would identify the truth differently from a different emotional state. So having courage for the truth is assuming that where we stand isn't the whole truth, and speaking through curiosity. I had a mentor that used to say, "Listen to be altered." And so, yeah, I think we have some really big polarities and dualities happening around the world. It's like liberal and conservative, or various different versions of that. But somewhere we're pushing and pulling on each other, and we're finding our way probably to a higher truth that none of us can yet see. And so that's what I mean by having courage for the truth and making space and time for those moments when a deep and meaningful moment arises, even if it's not on the calendar.
Thank you, Angela. And your note is going to be here in the chat about the truth, the courage for the truth that you are bringing up in connection to what David was asking. And thank you for this too. Jennifer, Jen, do you want to? different responses to the same question of what do we do now? The non-binary, complex, creative, liminal. These are some of the ways that come up when we think of Anzaldúa's processes. Don't need to talk. Okay, yes, I see.
Rosa, Mary Lou put a question or
There's
comment
something-
in the chat before Sarah Beth put the stages again. I just
Mary
wanna make
Lou?
Sure.
So we have Asa and we have Mary Lou before that.
Okay, yeah, I was just interested in what this way of thinking suggests about how we move forward. I understand how to get, I have at least a sense of what we're talking about how challenging it is at the beginning, but also it seems like it's a call toward how can we come to a place where we are really addressing what's going on? And so anyway, that's my question.
When you say really addressing what's going on, what do you mean by that? Because there's so much going on.
Well, you know, there's a resistance being organized. The Congresswoman from Seattle is doing resistance labs. There's lots of people protesting all over the country. Other people are trying to think what's the next step after protesting on picketing somewhere. And so what I'm hearing with this is that there's like a personal, internal, psychological, maybe spiritual inner work that needs to happen in order to move people to a place where they can have effective impact on what's happening. And so that's my question is, what is that work that can free people to begin to do what needs to be done, and maybe something about the work that we need to do and how we do it. I don't know if that's part of it, but maybe. I don't know if that's more clear, but.
Again, I have responses. Rosa, did you want me to take
Yeah,
that?
just yes, and yeah, please. And I just want to acknowledge that it's past 5, and some people have been leaving wonderful comments in the chat, but they are no longer with us. But the ones that decide to stay a little bit longer, we are here, and we will be here until we have to be here. So thank you, Mary Lou, and Tanji, please go ahead with your thoughts.
Well, so, I mean, there's many things that you said there, and I'll try to address as much of it as I possibly can. But one of the things that really surfaces for me, and I think this is a lack of language, a lack of helpful language in these regards. And oftentimes when we ask these questions, we use words like, how can we begin to do this work? How can we begin to find transformation? Well, the first answer is these things have already begun. We are working in a long genealogy of ongoing work. We are standing on the shoulders of the people who've come before us as we navigate what's in front of us. And we are doing our best to, as Anzaldúa would say, live the future we want to see, right? And so, again, I find myself using that language all the time, and it can be helpful to just pause, and beginnings and endings is a limiting language. And so what are the genealogies that we're already working within? Anzaldúa is giving us great things, and we know even from the conversation, she draws on many strengths and insights that we can continue to work with. And the fact that people are here or protesting or having these difficult conversations, that is part of the ongoing work. And that is happening, and we can continue to work with those things. And when it comes to concrete plans, I think it has to be a dynamic, multifaceted one where we're doing inner work, and we're also, as to kind of nod back to a little bit of the conversation before, like examining what roles we have personally, interpersonally, and institutionally. So we have to be working on multiple fronts at the same time, but not overextending ourselves in ways that we make ourselves martyrs to the cause, right? So also ways of taking care of ourselves. I was talking with a former student the other day, and we reflected on how weird it can feel to do nurturing acts for ourselves, Like I like playing in my yard, which is something that is one of the most healing things I can possibly do is growing plants, right? And you know, having just listened to the news, I'm like, what am I doing out here while everything is so crazy and difficult and outrageous? And actually, that can also be very, very important work of just taking care of myself, because the last thing I want to be is tired and overextended and short-circuited with other people, right? And so that's kind of a answer to it all, but the dynamic, multifaceted processes while recognizing that this is ongoing work. I think one of the biggest mistakes or struggles we've encountered is the assumption that I say we in this sort of like grand sense, because I don't know that individually people here have felt this, but the US is only ever progressing, only ever getting better than our past and our history. I think that creates a kind of complacency for doing this kind of ongoing work when we think, well, we're only progressing, we'll only get better. So I'll stop there because I've said a lot of things.
Thank you, Tanji. I think it came across very clearly, and I totally second this approach. And just a reminder, if this is helpful, a reminder that this type of crisis or coincidental combination of crises is by design. Part of the intention is to trigger the responses that you have, the sense of urgency, immediate gratification. I want to solve, I have to see something, and not seeing that creates a lot of like frustration because then nothing is happening. But it's part of it's part of the design. So in order to be really rebellious, Anzaldúa is telling you pull the brake a little bit, but don't remove your foot from the gas. So just keep there and keep going, and be in a collective context and remain in collective context, so that you don't isolate and assume that whatever is happening is something that only affects you, or that you have all the responses or the responsibilities. So it is sharing this, and probably sharing more of these kinds, probably not exactly this kind of conversation, but this asking these questions to each other, like how are you doing at this and this and that regularly, because that keeps moving something. So I think I'm somehow reiterating part of what Tanji said, but that's what I was going to with that. And thank you, Mary Lou. Yes, Tanji?
I appreciate
Thank
you saying
you.
that, because that is one of the things that's most readily available to us, is what we put out into the world, how we treat other people that we're with. And even if I can't change the policies that are happening, I can do my best not to keep the wounding continuing, you know? So yeah, I appreciate what you just said, Rosa. Sorry, I talked over you, Mary Lou.
Yeah, we have some people that we want to call here, but like there are some other words that keep coming here, supporting this idea that this is just not something that's going to happen overnight. But we have Asa and Lisa. Okay, Asa, you brought up a question on Friedman. What is your question?
Yeah, I think it goes back a while in the conversation, but returning to the kind of, I love the framing with the shock doctrine and thinking about it in that way. And one of the things that stood out from that opening quote was that, I don't remember the exact words, but something like you use the tools and concepts that you have at hand when the disaster happens. So it's not necessarily in response to like those concepts that are then implemented, like this free market radical takeover is not invented out of the shock. It was already there waiting for it. And so I think if we try to, flip it to this shock, it's like, what are those concepts that we've already, and I think one thing, Tanji, you had talked about that hit me here was like using past experiences of shock or pains in our own lives to learn how to respond. Because I think one of the dangers is in just being responsive to like ongoing attacks, you're always rooted in those attacks still, like in, you know, trying to be opposed rather than coming from a place of, you know, like Milton Friedman did, of like this whole ideology that's in place just to plug in when there's an opening. So thinking, I guess it's not a question so much, but wanted to bring that back in and see how that relates maybe to the larger, Anzaldúan concepts.
I think that the tricky part with enacting the work of the Napata is we can cultivate ideas for how to navigate the next crisis, but sometimes the next crisis, those ideas don't fit the situation, and we have to be creative again, which is one disadvantage we might have when thinking with the idea of the shock doctrine and having these ideas readily available. People with money who can put those into the infrastructure very quickly. It's a different kind of beast, but I do think that there's something really valuable about that, and that's part of why I was seeing some overlaps, because I think the Napata can have ways of being readily available for when crisis comes, and sometimes it's just simply refusal. So Rosa, you brought up La Facultad. That's something that can be helpful as well, because it's seeing the pattern in things. And if you can cultivate and develop La Facultad, if you bear witness to these things, you can start to see the patterns, and simply, at least at the beginning, like in the beginning of your encounter with the crisis, I see this pattern. I will not carry this pattern out in my own world. Right? That can be one way, as you then work to figure out how to do otherwise simultaneously. But I do think that connection there is really important.
And there's an element.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yes, I appreciated the question. It has an element of rebelliousness, the response to that, because it is not being willing to respond with a prescribed, automatic, scripted way to do things in certain contexts, which means exercise independent thinking, which is, I would say, the most valuable thing that one can cultivate and have. Independent thinking, everything is telling you prescribed things to be how to be a good individual in this horrible society. No, I'm not gonna do that. So it's like independent thinking is what leads you to honor hold on to your own values, as opposed to those that are expected from forces that are just totally nothing to do with you, but that are presented as they are in your best interest, so that you have to do that to be accepted by others. So it's just this totally convoluted system of being part of a context. So independent thinking, that is part of La Facultad, is something that I think valuable, and just to be rebellious.
I
Tanji?
think that's valuable as well, but I would actually push on the idea of independence given the context of interconnectivity and interdependence. And I wonder if phrasing it more like divergent thinking, a willingness to go against the trajectories or to diverge, to move away from, because all of these things are relational, right?
Yes. Thank you, Tanji. That's very cool.
Did Lisa have a question?
No, I think it was a typo, a visual typo.
Oh, okay.
We have a very appreciative comments here in the chat. People are finding this valuable. That's wonderful. David, you have more here? Another comment, please.
Wasn't anything I needed to speak. I always have more.
But
I always
please,
have more.
please.
But no, just listening and just being reminded. And it's one of the things I as I said in the comment that I value so much about Anzaldúa, is her openness, her vulnerability, that this is crazy making work. This is hard work. And she talks about, the bees buzzing around in her head, and she can't get things to quiet down, and so many other images that she uses. So yeah, just that, for those that aren't as familiar with Anzaldúa, one of the reasons to read Anzaldúa is that it's a no bullshit zone. So she's not just like, oh, well, here's the way to do this and it'll be great. No, it's going to suck and it's going to drive you nuts. But it's also, what else are you going to do? What else are you going to do? So.
David, you reminded me of, and I'm not there to share something with one of my sisters in a context of crisis, like personal crisis. And everything is claiming for urgency. And what are you doing? And she told me, I'm counting ants. Counting ants. Yeah. Ants are crawling in the window and I'm counting one by one. Yes, but you told me that you need to pack and do this and this and that. I'm counting ants. So it was just like this kind of like going into I'm gonna count ants. So it's when people are able to connect with what is needed in that very moment, as opposed to what the urgent response that should be, or vice versa, right? So it's just was interesting. Just listening to you, David, remind me of my sister. Counting ants.
And I see Mary Lou's point. Absolutely. Of course, there's joy and pleasure and all the other things. But yeah, it's not a hallmark approach to doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, I agree. So there must be, because how defiant, right? Speaking of rebelliousness, Rosa, like how defiant is it to still cultivate joy? Which is, right, then you have to walk that balance, because we live in a culture that wants us only to pay attention to the joyful things and to the things that are comfortable. And so then how to walk that balance of, I'm willing to do the hard work and I still dare to have joy.
Mm-hmm. We have a poet at work in the chat. Ecstatic and awful. Oh.
I realized when someone puts something in the chat, I'm like nodding to it. I'm like, oh, no one knows that I'm nodding at the chat. I should probably say that.
Mm-hmm. And there are resources. We are going to keep adding some resources to the one recommendation that I have. I know that Tanji, you have is using Anzaldúa as part of your scholarly work and your dissertation, even before then, and your teaching, right? In my case, my use of Anzaldúa is a more on and off, and then checking in and going there in and out. But one recommendation I have to let's say plunge in Anzaldúa, so in a way is just to look closely at the table of contents of her few books, just the table of contents. And let's see how the table of contents is going to feel indeed like the tarot. Oh, okay, so I can go with either card. So I'm going to explore this, I'm going to explore that, and then just get familiar with something that is non-linear. And that is, and then you're going to find your own thread to explore because it resonates with you, right? As opposed to go there trying to just absorb what is there just because we know that is valuable, but it's only going to be valuable to the extent that it resonates with you at a given moment. So I don't, that's my approach to it, but I bet obviously everybody has their own way to get into new things. So is this it's a good place to close the conversation? Is there anything else you want to? Oh, let's see. Emma Goldman, David Tripp.
No, we just want to remind people next week, Malcolm X's 100th birthday. So come back for a conversation looking at his life and his work and his legacy. I think that it should be really powerful, and we're hoping that people will come bringing things, you know, like quotations or stories or, you know, something celebratory as a way of getting into his work. Bring a friend.
Bring a friend. A pleasure working with you, Tanji.